-40 degrees, a wind that can freeze bare skin in under 10 minutes. And out there in the whiteout, inside a shell of wooden poles and buffalo hide no thicker than a winter coat, a woman is feeding a fire no bigger than a dinner plate, and she is not afraid. Outside, the blizzard is loud enough to drown a shout. Inside, a child is asleep. That is not a painting, and it is not a legend. That is an ordinary Tuesday night on the northern plains, and it happened for 1,000 winters, and almost nobody today can explain how. Because for 2 centuries, soldiers and surveyors and settlers came onto this same grassland with wagons full of iron and canvas, and they died in the exact weather these families were raising children in. Not because the newcomers were weak, because they were fighting the wrong war. They tried to keep the winter out. The nations of the plains did something no engineer of that era would have believed possible. They let the winter in, and they put it to work. What they built was not a tent. It was a machine, and here is the first thing almost everyone gets wrong about it. The tipi is not a cone. Look closely at any real photograph from the 1800s, and you will see it. It leans. It is tilted, deliberately, and the smoke hole is not at the top. That crooked, imperfect shape is not a mistake, and it is one of the reasons that sleeping child is still alive in the morning. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why. And you will also learn the one thing that could bring an entire lodge to its knees in a single night. It was not the wind, it was not the snow, it was not the cold. It was something much, much quieter than that. So let me show you the machine, and then let me show you what happened to it. Now, before we go inside, I want you to notice something you believe without ever having tested it. You believe that a warm house is a sealed house. Thicker walls, tighter windows, nothing in, nothing out. Every one of us was raised on that idea, and we are paying a fortune right now to unlearn it, because the people of the plains understood the opposite, and they understood it perfectly. A sealed house is a house that is slowly dying. Put a family and a fire inside a closed room, and 3 things quietly begin to kill you. Carbon monoxide, invisible, odorless, patient. Moisture, which soak in your clothing until they stop holding heat. And at 40 below, wet clothing is a countdown. And your own breath, which turns the air stale long before you ever notice you are tired. So the tipi was built to do the exact opposite of sealing. It was built to breathe. Cold air slipped in beneath the lower edge of the cover, but it never blew across the family. It was captured and steered upward through a narrow channel hidden behind an inner wall. It fed oxygen straight to the fire at the center. The fire warmed it, and warm air rises, so it climbed toward the opening at the top and pulled fresh air in behind it. In, up, feed the fire, out. Continuously, silently, all night, with not one moving part. Today, engineers have a name for this. They call it the stack effect, and it is now the centerpiece of sustainable architecture buildings, designed to ventilate themselves, using nothing but temperature and geometry. The Plains nations did not have the equation. They had 10,000 nights of observation, and the discipline to hand every detail of it to their children without losing a single piece. What they ended up with was less a building than a body. A skeleton of pine, a skin of buffalo hide, a beating heart of fire, and lungs made of moving air. 12 to 20 lodgepole pines, 20 to 25 feet tall, wrapped in a dozen or more tanned hides, and here is the part that should stop you cold. That structure could be raised in under an hour, and when the camp moved, it could be stripped, folded, and loaded in less than 30 minutes. Think about what that actually means. This is the only house in human history that could stand up to a 40 below blizzard and then vanish from the earth in half an hour, which raises a question that almost nobody ever thinks to ask. Who designed this? Hold that question, because I promised you an answer first, and it starts with the shape. Put a square building on open grassland, and the wind hits it like a fist. Flat walls catch the full force, pressure builds on one side, suction tears at the other, and every gust goes looking for the weakest joint until it finds one. A curved, tapering shell does something entirely different. The wind does not hit it. The wind slides around it. There is no flat face to push against, and no corner to pry at. And a storm strong enough to peel the roof off a farmhouse can pour around a lodge and simply keep going. Snow behaves the same way. It cannot pile on a slope that steep, so it slides and it lands at the base, where instead of becoming a burden, it packs into a wall of insulation and seals the bottom edge against every draft. Which gives you one of the strangest reversals in the history of building. The worse the winter got, the better the house worked. But the textbooks stop there, and that is where they miss it. Because the Tipi is not a symmetrical cone, and I want to show you exactly why it lies. It is deliberately tilted. The back of the lodge, the side that faces the prevailing wind, out of the west and northwest, is built steeper, almost vertical. It presents a hard, braced shoulder to the weather, like the prow of a ship. The front slopes more gently, and that gentler slope does something specific. It pushes the smoke hole forward, off the peak, out of the wind's path entirely. And here is the payoff. That offset opening sits in a pocket of low pressure just behind the summit of the lodge, which means the wind does not shove smoke back down into the room. It reaches over the top, and it pulls the smoke out. The wind was not resisted. The wind was recruited. The harder the storm blew, the harder that house exhaled. And beneath the skin was an argument that lasted centuries. Some nations, the Lakota among them, began with a tripod 3 poles, bound and raised, stable from the very first move. Others, the Crow and the Blackfoot, began with 4. Ask which is better, and you will still get a passionate answer today, because this was never decoration. This was structural doctrine, taught, defended, and handed down, and the poles themselves were never rigid. Lodgepole pine is springy, so under a heavy gust the whole frame flexes, bleeds off the energy, and springs back the same principle we now build into skyscrapers, so they survive earthquakes. A structure that yields is a structure that survives, and they understood there was a philosophy buried in that sentence. The last piece was at your feet, where nobody looks. The cover was pinned to the earth with stakes driven at a slant, angled so that the harder the wind pulled, the deeper they bit. Where the ground was frozen or stony, heavy rocks ringed the base instead. And after every storm, the family went out into the cold and packed snow around the bottom of the lodge, burying the seam, killing the last of the drafts, adding weight against the wind. The blizzard was building their walls for them. But the greatest invention in this entire structure is the one you cannot see from the outside. Step through the door flap and look up, and you will find a second wall hanging on the inside of the poles, a liner, running from the ground to about the height of a standing man, with a narrow gap left between it and the outer hide. The Lakota called it the ozan. That gap does 3 things at once. First, it becomes a chimney hidden inside the wall. The freezing air coming in at ground level is caught in that channel and driven straight up behind the liner, so it never crosses the floor where people are sleeping. The cold is intercepted and put to work before it can touch a single body. Second, the still air trapped in that cavity becomes insulation, the same principle as a double-glazed window 900 years early. And third, and this is the one that kept people alive, it manages water. 15 people breathing all night. A cooking fire. Wet moccasins, wet robes, snow melting off the door. A closed shelter fills with moisture, and moisture is the real assassin in cold country, because damp clothing does not hold heat, and a person in damp clothing at 40 below is a person on a clock. In a tipi, that moisture rises, hits the freezing outer hide behind the liner, condenses there, and runs down into the ground. Wet wall, dry family. Which brings us back to the question I left with you. Who designed this? Who tanned the hides? Who calculated the curve of the cover? Who stitched it? Who raised it? Who decided where the liner hung? The answer is consistent across the plains, and for most people it is a shock. Women did. Women tanned the hides. Women designed and cut the cover, a compound curve, laid out flat on the ground, that had to fold into a precise 3-dimensional shell. Women raised it, maintained it, and ran it. And the lodge did not belong to the man of the family. It belonged to her. In many plains nations, when a marriage ended, the outcome was simple. The wife kept the lodge, and the husband walked out with whatever he could carry. So when we talk about the finest cold weather architecture in North America, let us give the credit accurately. It was designed, built, owned, and operated by women, and it outperformed everything the men who displaced them brought with them. At the center of it burned the fire, and it is nothing like the movies. No roaring blaze, a shallow pit, and a flame you could cover with 2 hands. A big fire inside a lodge is not warmth. A big fire inside a lodge is a mistake. It burns fuel you cannot replace until spring, and it overwhelms the draft until the room fills with smoke. And that fire was steered. 2 long poles reach the smoke flaps from outside, and those flaps were the throttle. The wind swings north, you swing the flaps. A gale rises. You narrow them and angle them so the storm passes over the top and drags the smoke out with it, like a hand pulling a thread. Somebody in that camp read the wind before sleeping, the way you check a lock. Get it wrong. And the whole family wakes up coughing. And out on the open prairie there were no trees at all, so they burned dried bison dung buffalo chips. Laugh if you want. Cured bone dry by a summer of sun and wind, it burns slow, burns hot, and burns with almost no smoke. And inside a hide lodge, less smoke is worth more than more heat. Along the rivers, willow and cottonwood were split, dried, and stacked inside the lodge, because wet wood is worthless wood. And at night the flame was banked down to embers enough to hold the lodge above freezing, and not one stick more. That is not poverty. That is an energy policy, planned months ahead, executed daily, and taught to every child in the circle. Which leaves me owing you one last answer. I told you at the start that one thing could bring a lodge to its knees in a single night, and that it was not the wind, not the snow, and not the cold. Here it is. That ventilation system runs on two forces, the heat of the fire and the wind outside. Take the wind away on a cold, damp, dead still night, with heavy air and not one breath moving across the plain to lift the column, and the smoke stops rising. It hesitates at the opening. It hangs there. It settles. And it comes back down. So understand what that means. The blizzard was never the enemy. The blizzard was the engine. The blizzard was the thing that made the house breathe. The enemy was the stillness. The storm kept them alive, and the quiet could kill them, and they knew it. On those nights the flaps were set differently. The liner was lifted at the base to draw a thread of air. Light dry wood was burned clean and hot to force the column up by heat alone, and somebody stayed awake. And I don't think that lesson belongs only to the 1800s. We are all taught to fear the storms, the crisis, the loss, the cold season of a life. But ask anyone who has actually come through one, and they will tell you the same thing. The storm gave them focus. The storm gave them each other. It is the stillness afterward that has to be survived on purpose. The Plains nations built that truth into the roof over their children's heads. You can see it in how they lived under it. The floor layered with dry grass, evergreen boughs, and heavy robes. Everyone with a place around the fire. And when the light failed, the elders spoke history, law, water, weather. There was no written archive out there. The archive was the evening, and it was rebuilt out loud every single night in front of the people who would have to carry it next. And no lodge stood alone. The camp stood in a circle, doors facing east, and when the worst storms came, young men broke trail through the drifts and went door to door, checking the elders, the widows, the fires that might have gone quiet. The lodge protected the family. The circle protected the people. So here is the ending nobody tells you. The Tipi never failed. In the 1870s and 80s, tens of millions of buffalo were destroyed in barely more than a decade, and the Tipi's entire supply chain vanished with them. Then came the reservations. Then the families were moved into houses. Small, square, wooden, government issue, rigid walls, one stove, and a sealed room. And the square house did not breathe. Reservation physicians and agents recorded what came next in their own reports. Damp, unventilated, overcrowded cabins, and tuberculosis moving through communities that had been raising children through 40 below winters one generation earlier. Let that land. The house they called primitive had solved airflow, humidity, and heat, all at the same time. The house they called civilized had solved the floor plan. The wind became ventilation. The snow became a wall. The worst night of the year became the thing that kept the fire drawing clean. And today, in architecture schools and engineering labs, we are spending real money to rediscover exactly that. We call it innovation. It might be more honest to call it remembering.